The term organized crime often conjures up images of Italian mobsters ruling over an urban cityscape, using violence and corruption to secure protection and wealth. However, organized crime dates back centuries, predating even the creation of the Sicilian Mafia, to a time when pirates, bandits, and highwaymen roamed rural roads and the seas, seeking to steal whatever they could get their hands on. In fact, the earliest iterations of organized crime were nowhere near as glamorous as the lives of many involved in such groups in more modern settings, and by all accounts, it has never been a noble cause, often destructive to society and leaving many victims in its wake. Join us for this documentary as we examine the history of organized crime. Early iterations of organized crime. Though it is difficult to pinpoint the exact beginnings of organized crime, writer Paul Lund described that piracy and banditry were, to the pre-industrial world, what organized crime is in modern society. Whether Vandals, Goths, the Norse, Turks, or Mongols are not normally thought of as organized crime groups, yet they share many features associated with thriving criminal organizations. They were, for the most part, non-ideological, predominantly ethnically based, used violence and intimidation, and adhered to their own codes of law. However, one example of someone aligning with such values dates back to ancient Rome. Greek historian Cassius Dio regularly told the tale of Bulla Felix, an Italian bandit leader who was active for several years beginning in 205 CE. Felix led a group of over 600 men, which included the likes of runaway slaves, and modern writers have noted that Felix's tale shares similarities with Zorro and Robin Hood, the latter of which was due to his desire for social justice. Felix and his men acted similarly to highwaymen by stealing from travelers, although they never resorted to killing and sought only to steal riches from their victims before releasing them. He subsequently distributed the money amongst the poorest in his community, hence the modern comparisons to Robin Hood. Felix's story ends with him being captured in 207 CE, when the married woman he was having a relationship with was pressured by her husband to hand him over in exchange for immunity from prosecution. His band of men broke up after Felix was sentenced to death. Though Felix is almost certainly a work of fiction, it's interesting that such a story existed during the Roman Empire, though perhaps not entirely surprising, as this era was not without its share of criminals. While there are few surviving records by Roman imperial bureaucracy describing the activities of criminals during this time period, through stories and other evidence, it has been concluded that highwaymen and other bandits were common throughout Roman history, and their prevalence ramped up during the crisis of the 3rd century, a period of time in which foreign invasions, civil wars, and economic hardships threatened to collapse the Roman Empire. Highwaymen were most prevalent during the late 1600s. Specifically, they operated the most between 1660 to 1714, and many were known to have been former soldiers or military officers left over from the English Civil War and French Wars. Highwaymen during this time were greatly aided by the fact that it was difficult to enforce laws and dole out punishment, as there was little in the way of law enforcement, and such officers who did exist had limited resources and capabilities. Some highwaymen operated the equivalent of a protection racket, where travelers would pay a fee in order to avoid being targeted and attacked. The most common victims of such criminals were coaches, including public stagecoaches and mail carriers. All were regularly held up by highwaymen, and the phrase, "stand and deliver," became commonplace. Traveling was, by all accounts, difficult, tedious, and often dangerous, as encounters with highwaymen could turn bloody if the target tried to resist. English politician and writer Horace Walpole was shot at Hyde Park, London, by highwaymen, and later wrote, "One is forced to travel, even at noon, as if one was going to battle." Highway robberies declined during the 18th century in France, due to the introduction of a heavy law enforcement presence. In England, however, it wasn't until 1815 that highway robberies became less common. The last recorded crime of this nature occurred in 1831, but there is a lot of debate as to what exactly led highwaymen to become less prevalent. One theory is that the development of railways contributed to their disappearance, but highwaymen were already becoming obsolete when railways began to be built. Manned and gated toll roads have also been credited, but such roads were rare and often flanked by rural paths without guards, so it has been argued that this doesn't make sense either. One thing that may have contributed to the disappearance of highway robbers was that handguns became more available and affordable to everyday people, meaning that they could easily arm and protect themselves from danger. Another strong suggestion was the introduction of a greater police force that patrolled around London at night. Around this time, London was expanding quickly too, which meant that many of the most dangerous parts of the city were being built upon, removing them as potential ambush spots for criminals and forcing them out of town. Piracy is also considered a prelude to organized crime, with some of the earliest examples of such crimes taking place in the 14th century BCE. The ancient Greeks reportedly saw piracy as a very normal and honorable way to make a living, with many texts of the time indicating that the abduction of women and children to sell into slavery was commonplace. These attitudes changed as the era of classical Greece began, however, with many condemning piracy as a way of living, labeling it a disgrace. Perhaps the most common and best-known example of pirates, at least in Europe, were the Vikings, who invaded and pillaged actively between the 8th and 12th centuries, mainly targeting Western Europe, the coasts of North Africa, and various bodies of water, including the Black Sea and numerous rivers in Eastern Europe. However, slave traders are also a strong example of pirates, particularly following the growth of the slave trade during the colonial era, between the 15th and 20th centuries. Such traders not only captured individuals to traffic themselves, but also attacked slave ships, often to take the goods and people on board to resell them. Pirates regularly used such slaves on their own ships, implementing them as domestic servants, rowers, or as sex slaves. On top of pirates and highway robbers, there were also bandits. Such criminals were most common in the medieval period, during the 16th century, but banditry occurred as far back as the Roman Empire, and later in Ming China, a period between 1368 and 1644. The Ming government defined banditry as robbery by force and noted that it was punishable by death. But despite this, many people operated as bandits during this time, in part thanks to widespread famine, which led to further hardships and eventually gave rise to banditry. James W. Tong, a political scientist and author, concluded that the likelihood of surviving such hardships was minimal, while surviving by turning to banditry was maximal. During the Ming Dynasty, mounted bandits were the most prominent, often ambushing victims on the roads around Beijing and the surrounding areas, known as the Capital Region. Historian David M. Robinson observed that there were many factors which contributed to the high number of bandits in the Capital Region during this time. For one, much of the area was ravaged by natural disasters, more often than not, flooding, which led to agricultural struggles and many poor people to remain in poverty. Secondly, the area was an excellent opportunity to carry out banditry, as these larger cities often drew in merchants and had better economies, making theft very lucrative. Furthermore, a large proportion of bandits were soldiers, and the Capital Region was home to a vast majority of them. In 1449, Mongolian soldiers who were part of the Ming Dynasty's military raided and robbed in the Beijing area. 40 years later, more soldiers attacked the Henan province. The overall economic hardships throughout the country caused most soldiers to seek other ways of making a living, including illegal activities, and specific rules allowed them to get away with such crimes. For example, soldiers could not be apprehended by civil authorities, and since their superiors often didn't live in the area, there was no military personnel around to capture those caught partaking in criminal activities. Fencers are another example of criminals operating during this time, as part of the criminal underground that ran not just in the Ming Dynasty, but also in the later Qing Dynasty. Fencers were tasked with selling stolen goods, often to more respectable community members, and generally came from a poorer background, like many bandits did. Many locals turned a blind eye to such activities in return for products or money. As well as selling stolen goods, fencers were also involved in trafficking hostages that had been kidnapped by bandits. Women and children were regularly captured and sold, with women mostly being sold into sex work, although some were sold as wives or concubines. Their value was more often than not dependent on their physical appearance. The more attractive a woman was deemed to be by men, the more money she would be sold for. Children were often sold as servants or entertainers, but many young girls were also sex trafficked. Harborers were another huge component of the criminal underground during the Ming Dynasty. Such individuals would provide safe houses for criminals and sometimes even participate in fencing. Many safe houses were unexpected businesses such as tea houses or inns, but the likes of opium dens, gambling parlors, and brothels were also used to help hide criminals. Brothels themselves were often motivated to participate in crimes, since a Ming law stated that such establishments were exempt from being held responsible for the criminal actions of their clients. While owners of such brothels and parlors were expected to report suspicious activity to the appropriate authorities due to a lack of enforcement, many did not. 17th century and beyond, the Yakuza and the American frontier. While there is some difficulty in pinpointing the exact origin of the infamous Japanese Yakuza, most modern branches of the organization derive from two social classifications which first appeared during the Edo period, which ran between 1603 and 1868. These branches are the Takiya, who often peddled stolen or illegal goods, and Bakuto, those who were involved with the gambling scene. The Takiya were highly structured and hierarchical, with a boss at the head of said hierarchy. While both of these groups were ranked as some of the lowest social groups during the Edo period, the Bakuto had the lowest standing of the two since gambling was illegal. They utilized abandoned temples or shrines to create their dens, and many gambling parlors ran loan sharking businesses. Though the Takiya was later recognized by the Edo government, the Bakuto was largely viewed with contempt. The rituals of both can be seen today in modern Yakuza initiation ceremonies, and some members still identify with one of these specific groups. As the Yakuza began its own formation, it adopted a similar structure to that of the Takiya. The head of the hierarchy is the Oyabun, which loosely translates to boss or chief, while members are referred to as Kobun. The Oyabun is also known as the chairman. This structure resembles that of a family, where the Oyabun is the surrogate father whom the Kobun, the surrogate children, owe their loyalty to. Many Yakuza organizations that are larger in size have a multi-layered structure, in which eventually some of the Kobun become Oyabun and begin running their own subsidiaries within the overall group. For example, the 6th Yamaguchi-gumi, a Yakuza group founded in 1915, has over 3,000 active members and reportedly has between 5 and 6 layers. The Yakuza are well known for several of their strict rituals, the first of which is yubistum, the act of cutting off one's finger in order to be punished or show remorse for a wrongdoing. Yubistum translates to finger shortening. Following a first transgression, the offender must cut off the tip of his left little finger and give the severed piece to his boss. This act may sometimes be carried out by an underboss to protect the offending member of his group from further retaliation. The practice has its roots in the Bakuto group, as it was sometimes found acceptable for gamblers who could not pay their debts to repay them by carrying out yubistum. The other strict ritual adhered to by the Yakuza is that of obtaining full-body tattoos known as irizumi. These tattoos often take years to complete, not just due to the size, but because they are often hand-poked, meaning they are done with steel needles or needles of sharpened bamboo, rather than being carried out using a modern tattooing machine. The Yakuza are involved in a whole array of different activities. For example, they play a heavy part in drug trafficking, specifically in that of methamphetamines. Although many Yakuza syndicates, including the previously mentioned Yamaguchi-gumi, forbid their members from engaging in such activities, numerous other groups are heavily involved in it, such as the Dojinkai, which is headquartered in Kurumi, Fukuoka. Of those Yakuza members and its associates arrested in 2014, over 1/4 were lumped with drug charges such as import or export, the sale of, or the possession of meth. Over the past 15 years, however, one of the main sources of the Yakuza's funding is fraud, which involves cheating the elderly out of large amounts of money. In some cases, members of the group will pose as their distressed children, while others will pretend to be financial experts who promise to help them grow their savings or assets. The Yakuza are also known to be heavily involved in extortion and operate protection rackets. However, as opposed to many organized crime units, wherein criminals will target small and vulnerable businesses, the Yakuza prefer to harass larger corporations. They often do this by purchasing a small amount of stock and attending stockholders' meetings where they physically intimidate other attendees. Another prominent activity of the Yakuza is human trafficking. Many members promise young women and girls from impoverished villages in the Philippines a good job and other prospects if they travel to Japan. However, these individuals are subsequently forced into sex work and exotic dancing instead. Notably, the Yakuza's crimes are not limited to Japan or countries in Southeast Asia. They have made their presence known in various parts of the US beginning in the 1960s, with the largest group of Yakuza being situated in Hawaii. Hawaii is used as a midway point between the two countries, where they often smuggle in drugs and smuggle out weapons. Women, unsurprisingly, are largely uninvolved in the day-to-day activities of the Yakuza. It is a male-dominated organized crime group, wherein women are relegated to informal roles such as mediating, providing emotional support, and caring for young affiliates. At most, women may be allowed to manage Yakuza-owned establishments such as clubs. Though there have been some important women in the periphery of the Yakuza, such as Tauka Fumiko, who became the de facto head of the Yamaguchi Gumi for several years following the death of her husband in 1981, there has only been one woman who was ever made an official member of the Yakuza. Nishimura Mako became involved with the group when she was just 20, when a member took her under his wing and showed her how to engage in blackmail, solve issues, collect money, and scout girls for sex work. When she came out on top following a physical altercation, she was called to the boss's office of a local Yakuza group, where she was eventually formalized as a member of the clan. She left the Yakuza in her 30s and spent years going back and forth between joining and leaving numerous clans. In the process, she got married, had 2 children, and then divorced her violent husband. She ended up leaving the Yakuza for good in the following years and found a job in construction. Meanwhile, in the US, the organized crime movement can be traced back to the American frontier, or the Wild West, a period that started in the 17th century and ended in 1912. Examples of such groups included the Cochise Cowboy Gang and the Wild Bunch. The Cochise Cowboy Gang was a group of outlaws living in Arizona in the late 1800s. These men operated as cowboys, or cattle rustlers, who frequently rode into Mexico and stole cattle before heading back into the US to resell them. In an attempt to stop groups such as these, the Mexican government added forts along the US-Mexican border and implemented tariffs, making it a much less appealing way of making money. However, all this did was drive such cowboys further inland, where they targeted neighboring ranches in the US and resold livestock to unscrupulous butchers. As well as trading in stolen animals, they held up stagecoaches and stole valuables in the same way that bandits and highwaymen did. The Cochise Cowboy Gang was rather unprincipled, like many such groups are. Rather than stealing items and fleeing the scene, they were known to harm and even kill drivers and passengers. Meanwhile, the Wild Bunch is best known as being the gang of Butch Cassidy and Harry Longabaugh, or the Sundance Kid, both of whom have recognizable names thanks to the 1969 film. The Wild Bunch were active for several years between 1899 and 1901 and were made up of 19 individuals. Like the Cochise Cowboy Gang, they regularly stole livestock and held up stagecoaches and other victims, but their main claim to fame was their skills when it came to train robbing. Though their career as a group was short-lived, the Wild Bunch are considered the most successful train robbing gang in history, and their success in such endeavors led them to obtain huge amounts of notoriety up and down the country. Other infamous U.S. criminals during the American frontier were the James Younger Gang, led by Jesse James, his brother Frank, and Cole Younger. This specific gang stemmed from that of Confederate guerrilla soldiers, who, after the Civil War, continued to raid, pillage, and murder as they saw fit. However, the gang did not become the James Younger Gang until at least 1868. Following a decade of robbery in 11 states and living on the run, the Younger brothers were apprehended in 1876. Although Jesse James went on to create a new gang, he was murdered in 1882 by Robert Ford, one of the men with whom he'd founded the new group. The James Younger Gang had several associates, including Myra Starr, better known as Belle Starr, an outlaw who was murdered in 1889. Her case reportedly remains unsolved. Criminal gangs during the 1800s were not solely limited to those on the American frontier, however. 40 Thieves is another notable U.S. gang which dates back to 1825 and is considered New York City's oldest criminal street gang, consisting of both Irish immigrants and Irish Americans. The group spent much of their time harassing those living in the Five Points neighborhood of Manhattan. The group was formed by Edward Coleman in 1825 in order to rebel against the low social status bestowed upon them by the U.S. Prejudice against the Irish and class divides led many members of the group to grow frustrated. They often struggled to find stable income and lived in squalor, in housing infested with mosquitoes and disease. However, the gang's actions quickly turned from determined protesting to straight-up crime as they sought to vent these frustrations. They began meeting at a grocery store owned by a woman named Rosanna Pierce, an infamous fence who sold illegal alcohol. The group were given assignments and quotas to meet, with their criminal activities ranging from bog-standard robbery to knife fighting, assault, and murder. High crime rates and unending violence plagued the neighborhood of Five Points, throwing it into chaos for years. The community lacked government support, and the 40 Thieves established connections with Tammany Hall, a political organization created in 1786, which led to rampant corruption. The gang dissolved by 1850, however, with many members leaving to join larger gangs or start afresh. Its founder, Edward Coleman, was charged and convicted of the murder of his wife, Anne, in 1839. He was the first man hanged at the Tombs prison, built in 1838. The 19th century, England and the Peaky Blinders. The precursor to London's criminal world sprang up during the Victorian era, between 1837 and 1901. In a similar way to the Yakuza, hierarchies and ranking systems began to take shape within criminal groups, which were sometimes referred to as families, although these systems were not quite as elaborate as those of their Japanese counterparts. Many of these earlier criminal gangs in England carried out more mundane crimes like theft, forgery, counterfeiting, and money laundering, although they were also known to operate prostitution rings as well. One of the most infamous groups of this time was the Birmingham-based Peaky Blinders, whose name is now known across the world due to the BBC show of the same name. The popular story is that the Peaky Blinders got their name due to the style of cap they wore, a flat cap with a peak, and the idea that they stitched disposable blades into the peaks of these caps, allowing them to use the garments as weapons. However, the Peaky Blinders formed in the 1880s, long before the first disposable safety razor was manufactured in the UK in 1908. Birmingham historian Carl Chin has suggested instead that the name was possibly a reference to the gang's MO, where they would pull the hat peak down over their victims' faces so that they could not describe who robbed them. The word blinder may also refer to the Birmingham slang term used to describe someone or something of stylish and smart appearance. While the Peaky Blinders group didn't form until the 1880s, the previous 3 decades provided a fertile breeding ground for such a unit to take shape. Economic difficulties led many to turn to crime, even youths who participated in robbery and pickpocketing. During the 1850s, Birmingham was known to have numerous gambling dens and other such establishments, much to the displeasure of wealthier citizens. Their pressure on the police led authorities to crack down on them, and youth gangs began to form as a way to fight back. They fought both the police and assaulted members of the public, and by the 1890s, there were many of these groups made up of men and boys between the ages of 12 and 30. The Peaky Blinders veered off on their own in the 1880s, made up of some of the most violent members of these other groups. The Blinders soon established a territory for themselves in areas of Birmingham and Small Heath, which led them to expand operations to include the likes of protection rackets, smuggling, bookmaking, hijacking, and fraud. The gang were known to be terribly violent, and unlike some criminal gangs, their violence didn't just affect other groups. Rather, it affected locals and police officers alike. In particular, they had a disdain for authorities and often attacked the police in what was known as constable baiting. Hundreds of officers were injured during the reign of the Peaky Blinders. Abuse and assault by them was so bad that many policemen left the force to avoid it. While the gang's activities lasted until the 1920s, they began to withdraw from the criminal underworld years before this, in part due to the arrival of the Birmingham Boys, who controlled parts of London and northern England between 1910 and 1930. However, the Blinders also began to see less influence due to harsher policing and discipline. The Birmingham Boys remained in power until 1930, but lost large parts of their territory to the Sabini gang, run by Charles Darby Sabini, a British-Italian mob boss. Following the Second World War, the Sabini gang was taken over by Jack Spot Comer and Billy Hill, both of whom are considered prominent figures in London's organized crime underworld between the 1920s and 1960s. The 19th century, the Sicilian Mafia. The Sicilian Mafia, Cosa Nostra, or simply the Mafia, is one of the best-known examples of an organized crime group. Dating back to the 19th century and founded on the island of Sicily, the Mafia originally started as a protection group, but by the 20th century had expanded beyond that, dealing in drug trafficking, extortion, gambling, and money laundering, and infiltrating industries such as politics, construction, and finance. By 1876, it was already being labeled as an industry of violence. The Mafia is believed to have found its roots in the small private armies hired by absentee landlords to protect their estates from bandits during the time in Sicily when lawlessness existed. The men utilized as part of these armies eventually turned on the landowners and effectively became the law. They eventually extorted the landowners, demanding money in exchange for protecting the crops and other valuable resources on the land. Following this, their services expanded to include mediation and the enforcement of agreements, often by way of violence. Over the next several decades, the Mafia became a type of alternate legal system in Sicily. Like many large organized crime groups, there are distinct hierarchies and subgroups in place within the Mafia. Each family or clan within claims sovereignty over a specific area, be it a town, village, or even a neighborhood inside a large city. In this area, the specific clan will carry out its operations, more often than not, its protection rackets. This exclusive right to operate is always respected by other clans. Within each family is a boss, or don, who is elected by his fellow members to serve a one-year term. As with most organized crime, Mafia membership is restricted to men only. He is aided by an underboss and a counselor, the latter of whom aims to give a neutral perspective on the group's activities. Beyond the main three, there are associates as well as regular members, the former of which are useful individuals who work with the clan but are not actual members. For example, corrupt law enforcement. Mafia clans often work in partnership with one another by having open communications with one another. If one family wishes to do something which may affect another, the subject is always broached and discussed. Despite the overwhelming success the Mafia has had, it is not without its challenges or critics. Between 1925 and 1929, the government of Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini harassed the towns in which the Mafia was most influential, leading many members of the group to flee to the US. By 1929, 11,000 people had been arrested by the government. Though this temporarily stunted the growth of the Mafia, following the invasion of Sicily in 1943 by the Allied forces, many of the apprehended members were released under the belief that they'd been wrongfully targeted by Mussolini's government. In the following years, the Mafia and its associates began to take positions of power and also turned their attention to more legitimate businesses, including agriculture and construction. Mafia families were suddenly swimming in their newfound wealth, but with this new money came greed, infighting and competition amongst the various mafia families. In the 1960s, the first mafia war occurred, while a second took place in the 70s. The mafia continues to operate to this day, though its efforts are often hampered by Italian law enforcement. As recently as February of this year, 181 people were arrested in an attempt to stop the group from rebuilding in Sicily. As with many of these groups, there are numerous rituals and codes of conduct to abide by as part of the mafia. One such example is that members cannot write down incriminating information on paper or leave any kind of paper trail. As a result, no physical contracts exist for new members, but instead, an old-fashioned ceremony takes place. It has been described by several people as involving the prick of a lip or fingertip with a needle. Members of the mafia are also forbidden from betraying their comrades to authorities by penalty of death. They also follow a list of 10 commandments, which was discovered by Sicilian police in 2007 at a hideout, thought to belong to a mafia boss. The commandments are fairly obvious and include rules such as never being seen with cops, treating wives well, remaining truthful when interacting with fellow mafioso, and always being available for mafia duties, no matter the circumstances. The 20th and 21st century. Though many groups, such as the Triads, Yakuza, and Sicilian Mafia, date back several centuries, not all organized crime groups are so old. In the US, for example, organized crime mainly rose to prominence during the 1920s and the Prohibition era. Following the repeal of the 18th Amendment, which put a ban on alcohol, bootlegging came to an end, and all of the organized crime groups that established their name and fortune during this time turned to look for other means of bringing in cash. This led many of these groups to become even more highly organized, often adopting a mafia-style hierarchy that included different families who were in charge of different areas. Similarly, the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 led Russia to become flooded with organized crime groups. By the early 2000s, Russian official statistics showed that over 5,000 such groups were operating in the country and were responsible for an array of crimes including money laundering, tax evasion, and the murders of businessmen, journalists, and even politicians. The majority of these groups are headed by bosses who seek to prevent interference from outside forces. This often leads them to attempt to gain political influence and to bribe officials, whether it be government employees, politicians, or law enforcement, to turn a blind eye to their activities. Jury tampering is also a fairly common practice, as is witness intimidation. Both help to prevent gang members from facing any jail time. It's also commonplace for bosses of organized crime groups to invest the money they earn from their illegal dealings into legitimate businesses, sometimes to appear as proper businessmen, improve their social standing, make useful connections, and to avoid drawing suspicion. For centuries, racketeering, trafficking, and smuggling have been some of the biggest crimes that organized groups have been taking part in. Today, however, they are able to carry out online extortion and identity theft using modern technology, crimes which can be more difficult for law enforcement to trace, although not impossible by any means. On a similar note, once upon a time, such crime organizations worked against one another, competing to obtain and retain the most valuable resources, goods, and manpower. But a shift in recent years has led organizations to begin working together, as it allows them to consolidate power. For example, the American Mafia has numerous strong links to its counterparts in other countries, including the Sicilian Mafia itself. It has also worked with the likes of infamous London gangsters, the Cray twins, as well as the Russian Mafia, the Triads, and the Yakuza. While organizations were once local and multi-layered, many of the newer groups have less stiff and layered hierarchical structures, and rather than being local, they are often transnational. In 2009, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime estimated that transnational organized crime generated $870 billion that year alone, almost making up 7% of the world's exports of merchandise by itself. Over the decades, there have been numerous theories as to what may prompt someone to join an organized crime group. While many law enforcement bodies believe that money is the main motivator, The NSPCC has pointed out that many young people are groomed into joining organized crime groups as a result of their circumstances. Peer pressure, a longing for respect or power, a desire to feel safe and protected, or feeling as if they have no future, otherwise are just some of the reasons why young people may join a gang. Furthermore, the NSPCC has also noted that statistically, young people are more likely to be recruited if they've been excluded from school, have special education needs, suffer neglect, physical or sexual abuse, or have unaddressed mental health issues. In psychology, one theory suggests that people join organized crime believing that the pros outweigh the cons. They will gain massive financial rewards, obtain power and influence, and find freedom from many social norms and laws in exchange for risking prison time. Many of these individuals think that they are at a lower risk of being caught due to the perceived power of the group they have joined. For some people, it may seem like organized crime does not affect them. Many believe that unless they are living directly in a neighborhood or region rife without an obvious gang members that such groups do not impact them. But this is demonstrably false. And organized crime has a knock-on effect on many facets of the lives of ordinary people. For example, resources that could be allocated to helping lift children out of poverty are instead invested in programs and schemes designed to help law enforcement tackle organized crime groups. According to Crime Stoppers UK, serious and organized crime costs the country £37 billion annually. Meanwhile, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime has observed that increasing numbers of organized crime groups serve only to fuel more violence and chaos in a region, and that many of their operations deprive communities of money, work, and other resources which help to keep society running. One such example would be that fraudulent medicines or incorrectly handled food products might enter the market and not only defraud the public, but also put their lives and health at risk. Another is that counterfeit products may not only lead to countries missing out on useful tax revenue, but may also harm legitimate companies, which in turn could lead to unemployment and economic hardships. Furthermore, local crime may drive people out of certain areas, increase insurance costs, and lead to the overall disintegration of a community. Crime Stoppers UK also noted that between 2015 to 2016 and 2017 to 2018, firearm offenses increased by 25%. That in 2017, 43% of businesses suffered at least one cybersecurity breach or attack, and that online child sexual exploitation and abuse referrals rose by 700% between 2014 and 2018. On top of that, in 2017, there was a 35% increase in victims of trafficking and slavery referred to the National Referral Mechanism, a framework in the UK for identifying potential victims of modern slavery and making sure they receive the help they need. Organized crime often has a better chance at flourishing when a country or its government are in the center of turmoil. Christopher Kinahan Sr. of the Irish Kinahan family, who are known drug traffickers, was able to take advantage of the fact that Dublin was suffering from a drug crisis and economic hardships when he began supplying more heroin into the city. Similarly, the collapse of the Soviet Union had been preceded by numerous revolutions in Eastern Europe in 1989, as well as the failed 1991 August coup, and this disintegration of the state led to uncertainty and chaos. Many countries that were once part of the state fell into poverty. Flimsy governments, systematic injustices and corruption, and economic difficulties all contribute to the rise of organized crime and its ability to take root in society.